Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's Daily Devotional. Wasn't sure we were going to have a devotional today. My internet has been out for most of the day, but it came back in just in time. So here we are in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. We're going to start in verse 7. And this is kind of on the heels of yesterday's devotional, describing from Philippians chapter 4 the need to trust in God and to avoid worrying beyond measure, beyond the concern that we have for affairs that are taking place in our world, and instead causing these cares and concerns to be a distraction from serving God and from the perspective we're to have as Christians. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul says in verse 7, "Lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations. A thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure." Paul, he's in a broader context, describing the super apostles that he's dealing with, and or that are at Corinth that he's been kind of dealing with the last couple of chapters, and he's describing the fact that he's not going to boast in himself. As opposed to these other men who are boasting in themselves and claiming to be apostles. Paul's not going to boast in himself. And Paul describes in verse 7 that a thorn in the flesh, a messenger of Satan, was given to him. God allowed it. God didn't send it because it's a messenger of Satan. What this thorn in the flesh was, we know that he had issues with his eyes. He even tells the Galatians in Galatians chapter 4 that you would have plucked out your own eyes and given them to me. Whether that is what he's referring to or something completely different, another issue that he dealt with, we don't know. But in verse 8 he says, "Concerning this thing I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me." So notice that, just kind of as an aside, despite the fact that Paul had the power of the Holy Spirit as an apostle and he was able to heal others, he's not able to use that power for himself. And I think that's a very important point to make, that the power of God, as it was used in miraculous works, wasn't something that could just be used for one's, not even necessarily one's own personal gain, obviously, in terms of motivation, but even for the benefit of an individual, for themselves. At least in this case. Now, whether or not that was a overriding rule all the time, I don't know. But in verse 8, Paul's pleading with the Lord that this messenger of Satan, this whatever this thorn in the flesh was, would be taken away from him. And in verse 9, "He said to me, 'My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me.'" So notice what the Lord responds. It's in red letters, as if this is Jesus speaking. And it's certainly, usually when Paul refers to the Lord, it's almost always, Jesus. And so it would seem as Jesus is speaking here in verse 9, whether it's Jesus or the Father or the Holy Spirit, it sounds like it's Jesus. But regardless, it's God. And in verse 9, "My grace is sufficient for you. My strength is made perfect in weakness." So basically, the answer is no. No, I'm not going to take this thorn in the flesh away from you. There was a reason why God and why Jesus allowed it in the first place. And it served the purpose, first of all, lest he be exalted above measure. It served the purpose of reminding Paul what his job was. It kept him humble, certainly. Whether or not that was something that Paul struggled with, or if that was a danger, and Jesus knew that, or whatever. The fact of the matter was, Paul says, "Lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations." The information that was being given to him, and you could even include certainly the abilities through the Holy Spirit and so forth. This helped to ground him. And in verse 9, when Jesus says, "My grace is sufficient for you," my grace, what I provide you, is enough to help you get through this, to help you endure this. My strength is made perfect in weakness. And there's a very crucial, very important point that Paul's going to bring out because of this. Therefore, most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. Therefore, I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches, in needs and persecutions and distresses, for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then I am strong. Paul, he says he takes pleasure in infirmities. Not that the infirmities themselves are pleasurable, or that the reproaches are pleasurable, or the needs or the persecutions or distresses. I take pleasure for Christ's sake. Why? Because I know the broader principle, or the broader gain, is that when I am weak, then I am strong. And the principle that Paul's bringing out of what Jesus says is that when we're at our weakest, that's when we trust in God the most. That's when we rely on Him the most. And my phone's going off. This is when the important elements of our trust in God, our relying on His will, our relying on His plan, His wisdom, all of that is part of what Jesus is saying here. My strength is made perfect in weakness. Not that we can't pray for things to be removed from us. That's not what Paul's point is in verse 8, or Jesus' point in verse 9. The point is that when we are going through difficult times, when we are going through distresses or needs or infirmities or reproaches, that we realize that we have to rely on Jesus, that we don't have power within ourselves to make any of it go away, for one thing, because generally infirmities, reproaches, needs, persecutions, we don't have control over those things. What we have control over, and in some cases, part of the reasons why we may be in reproaches or persecutions or distresses, is because of our faith, because of our trust in God in the first place. But Paul says, when I am weak, then I am strong, because I'm not relying on my own power, my own wisdom, my own plan. I'm relying on God instead. I'm relying on His wisdom, on His power, on the knowledge that He sees the big picture, that He knows what's best. And it's a very important point that Paul makes in the broader context of 2 Corinthians chapter 12 about these false apostles who were claiming in themselves authority, claiming in themselves power, and boasting and exalting themselves over Paul. They were trying to convince the brethren not to listen to Paul, listen to them. And Paul's point here is that this is contrary to it's kind of an antithesis to trusting in the Lord and allowing the Lord to lift you up, allowing the Lord to exalt you. In fact, this is what James brings up in James chapter 4 about putting our faith and our trust in the Lord. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and He will lift you up. And this is what Paul learned and gained, not only through this thorn in the flesh, but through the response from Jesus that he then shares. He says, I take pleasure. Again, it's not I take pleasure in what's happening to me necessarily. It's more like what James says in James chapter 1, when James says, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. It's the same kind of concept, that there is a broader or a larger importance here that's taking place beyond just the current distress or the current issue in the flesh that we're dealing with, or even not even necessarily physical flesh, but emotional distress, or whatever the case may be. That in those moments remind us that all the time we have to rely on Jesus, because when we rely on Him, we rely on His strength, we rely on the Father and the Spirit. That's when we are at our strongest, because we realize it's not about us. And that's the very thing that Paul says in verse 7, that this thing was sent to remind him in the first place. All right, that's the daily devotional for you today. Just something, again, on the heels of what we talked about yesterday that I think kind of fits very well our own, not just worries and concerns and cares of life, but especially as these things in life start to affect us, start to specifically hurt us in some way. Again, whether it's physical, emotional, mental, persecutions, distresses, reproaches, needs, whatever the case may be, that we make sure that we remember that God is in control, that we remember that God has all power, and we in and of ourselves have nothing, and we have to rely on Him. All right. So our next daily devotional, Lord willing, and assuming the internet's working, Thursday, 6:30. Hope to see you all then. Thanks, everybody.